clamps.
Clamps.
There are so many variations on clamps and so many different types, so let's kind of stick to the ones that we use around here in the shop, and we can talk a little bit about those. So basically, a clamp is just to apply pressure to two different surfaces. Used a lot when you're fitting and also when you're gluing, especially glues which require a decent amount of pressure to actually make them work and hold things together. So I just picked out a variety of the clamps, just went around the shop and picked up a bunch of clamps and brought them over here so we could kind of talk about the different types and what they're good at and what they're not so terribly good at. So let's start out with probably the simplest ones and the easiest ones to use and the quickest, which are these little spring clamps here. And they're just relying on the pressure from this spring here to actually give you your holding power. Kind of a variation on those, slightly more complicated. The reach on this is a little bit better, so you can get around things a little easier than you can on these. And then the third type of these quick ones is this one here, which you can just clamp on there and actually do it quickly. The nice thing about those is that usually with one hand you can actually use the clamp. You don't need both hands to hold it and actually do the screw. So they're pretty quick and they're pretty easy. They do have a limited amount of holding power, not nearly as much as one of these other ones do here. One, because of the material they're made from, and also just the way that they rely on either a spring or some other kind of mechanism to hold things, hold things tight. Most clamps rely on the mechanism and then on friction too to kind of hold them in place. So when we get into slightly more complicated ones, we'll go over these. A lot of times these are called Norwegian clamps. We use these a lot in lap strake construction. They're simple ones. They're ones that you can build yourself and actually are quite effective, work quite well within that. Again, they don't have the power that, some of these cast iron ones do. But they do have quite a bit of clamping power inside there. And one thing that we've done with some of these, especially with ones with really long arms, is use this one initially to get a clamp and then stick another clamp around the jaws itself if you need to put a little more power to do that. Two different types. These seem pretty effective. We haven't had all that much luck with these, but they, in certain circumstances will actually work pretty well and work really well. So most of these have either relied on, some kind of a concentric to hold that together, or springs or anything like that. Different type of clamp, or these, the bar style clamps. With these Jorgensens, they kind of rely on this spring mechanism to kind of hold them together. These heavier duty Wetzlar ones just rely on the fact that this has a little bit of movement and that locks it in place and will keep it from going anywhere. In this case, with a screw thread like this and a good handle like that, you can get a lot of torque and a lot of pressure on these. Again, in terms of the amount that you can get on here, one with a handle like this, you'll be able to get a certain amount, but the amount that you can actually put on there with your hand grip will limit that a little bit. Once you start getting into ears or anything like that that are put on there, then you've got kind of a fulcrum or a lever, so you'll be able to put more pressure on that. You can also see that the rest of the clamp is a little heavier duty too, because at some points when you start getting clamps like this, which are really long or really big, you start getting a lot of deflection in it, so it starts to move on you. The ultimate one is basically this one here. It's just a monster. With a lot of threads, heavy duty here, and a big lever there, you'd be able to get a tremendous amount of pressure with something like this. too many times where you'll find that you need that much pressure. Just make better fifths. So cram them into place with that. These again, they're really handy because they can reach really far, but you have to be careful. These are cast, and they will deflect, and you can break these. You can snap these right on the corners if you try to crank down too much on these. A lot of times, you actually see with clamps like this, if people want to get a lot of pressure on there, they'll actually put a pipe on there, increase the amount of lever that they have on there so they can crank on it some more, but you can get to the point where you overload the clamp to the point where it just breaks down.
Does that have a name, that long one?
It's basically a long-throated C-clamp.
Yeah.
And C-clamps, well, a while back were probably the ones that were used the most and the most popular, and they still are pretty popular. We have, pretty good variety of them. A lot of times we've just gone to ones that either work a little bit quicker and aren't, quite as constrained in terms of distance there as far as clamping goes. Some specialty clamps, something like this, which you don't end up using, too terribly many times, but they do come in quite handy when you have something that you've got to hold in a certain way or a certain style. Half the trick to clamping is actually figuring out how you're going to clamp it. I think most people here run into situations where you're clamping things that aren't flat and square. They've got angles to them and everything like that, so then it becomes this whole game of figuring out how do I actually clamp this thing, and the clamp doesn't want to just spit itself out or just, squirt out from doing something. It's crazy like that. This is one way for uneven ones. You can actually put angles on this. Again, you have to figure out, some way, especially if you're doing something that's either pyramid shape or something that you want it to clamp it together that it doesn't actually squeeze out. Those. We'll talk a little bit more about setting up for clamping a little bit later. Smaller stuff here, bigger pieces, pipe clamps or cabinet clamps. This is the original pipe clamp. And again, we've got a good number of these, but it seems like most people have switched to using these little cabinet clamps here. These guys have got a wider throat, and they also seem to give you a little bit more even pressure when you're clamping something together, so they're pretty useful. Again, you are limited somewhat to how much power you can put into this by the strength of your wrist. In a clamp like this, you're not totally limited with that because you've got a lever here that you can really put quite a bit of pressure on if you need to on those. They've got all sorts of wild and different ways of actually setting the bottom of that, which just sets, and that one's motionless, and then you crank on this to actually give it the actual pressure with that. Let's see, what else have we got? And then clamps can be, quite simple. This is a clamping device that was made up by a former apprentice here that was doing some glued lap straight construction, and he would just put this between the planks and then use a couple of wedges on either side of this to wedge the thing and apply some pressure on it. So you can get pretty creative about ways of actually clamping things together. We did have, and I haven't been able to find, a couple of specialty clamps. They're about to start the planking process pretty soon on the Cliffy, and there's a couple of clamps that you can use in the planking process, which sometimes help things along. One was a combination of clamps. It's a little bit something like this, but not quite. where one clamp would clamp to the frame, and there'd be another clamp at 90 degrees or at a certain angle attached to that. And that one you could wind so that you could push your plank up against the next plank like that. It's kind of like that, but it was actually, it's a plank that's built specifically to do that purpose. And it wasn't very good at doing anything else other than that. There were also some little made up pieces of metal that basically did the same thing. They would wrap around the clamp or the frame itself, and then you would use wedges on top of it, and that would, wedge the plank up into place. And those, worked out pretty well too.
We've
I think
also,
on these, how they come apart.
Oh, you can go the other way? Yeah. And the other thing, there's where they are.
Right-hand blinking clamps.
So yeah, onto the frame, and then you can use that to actually, crank up on those. And there's a company now that's making very small versions of those for smaller boats. Yeah. All right, let's talk a little bit about actual clamping and how you have to kind of think your way through clamping certain things. The one I mentioned was where you've got, angles on it, and when you try to clamp, it just squeezes. So you can go in certain stages. The first one is you can always try to tack some sandpaper or something on the clamp itself, and if there's not too much of an angle, that will actually do it. The other thing is to actually tack things up on the piece that you're doing, so that creates shoulders that are closer to 90 degrees to the way that you're clamping, and that can do it too. And the other way is to think ahead about what you have to clamp, and maybe in the process of either cutting out the pieces that you're going to be using, you allow for that. We do that on when we glue up the pieces for the breast hook on the Susan skiffs. If people remember, you just do it oversized and cut out a couple notches that are square to itself, even though the breast hook is shaped itself. So think about it before you've actually cut the piece, just to, how you're gonna hold it all together. They were actually going through the whole process of gluing up, a big surface like that. So everything seems to work out fine, but it's a wide surface, and they don't really have a good way of putting pressure in the middle of it where there's a seam, and they want to make sure that that seam is, squared away or flattened out pretty well. And we were just thinking of trying to figure out different ways on Friday, how we do it. We can do bowed this and bowed that and stuff. And I think what they ended up coming down with was probably the simplest solution was just to glue the first two pieces in the middle together first, and then add the pieces on the ends
After they're dried?
after that's dry. Yeah, so they can keep that flat. And then the only problem with that is that it takes, 2 days to glue up instead of just 1 day. So it does take longer, but.
Yeah, that's probably not a good option in this.
Rick's like, come. So we'll see what they come up with.
We decided this morning that what we're gonna do is put wedges underneath the braces,
Yeah.
just in the middle,
In the middle to
and
keep
then
it.
clamp, and it'll bend down and put pressure in the middle.
Something that Bella suggested, which is the same concept, but it's to put a bit of bow into the braces themselves, playing the ends down just a little bit. We think the shims would be easier.
Yeah. And a lot of times, just by looking at the piece, the brace that's going across, because most of them will probably already have bow in them, just making sure that the bow is down can help with that a little bit too. Any questions or comments?
When you say, the checking the bow, are you talking about the long clamp and reverse it?
No, talking about, they've got those pieces going across
Oh, okay, right.
on there that they're using to
The
hold everything
wood,
down.
Yeah, yeah.
So if you look at this
Yeah.
way, you know, that naturally tends to go, sometimes use it. So a lot of things that we don't have here are, you know, ways of clamping things that are round. And that, you can use a whole bunch of different things to try to, you know, clamp. Rubber bands, inner tubes, hose clamps, yeah. All sorts of stuff to do, you know, series like that. So, yeah, a lot of times, you know, clamping is, number one, trying to find the right clamp to use it, but again, also figuring out either jigs or, you know, some way to actually hold the pieces together so that they don't end up flying all over the place on you when you're clamping them together.
Are those pieces underneath the blue bench, for clamping, or are they something else?
Underneath the blue bench?
Yeah, all those,
For curves.
Those are for doing like laminated frames and deck beams and like longer curves.
okay.
So that metal bracket that can slide in that open slot between the two pieces of oak.
Okay.
There's a nut in there. So you can screw them down to your lock and be able to glue up a whole series of molds or frames. Like it's how we built those to do all the frames. And like that things along those lines.
And I just wanted to point out this, if everybody doesn't know it, these, I call them squishy clamps, but, this, you pull that and loosens up and it's on that pin, but you can turn it around and get it on that pin again.
Put it on the
Clamp
other end.
Oh, yeah, that's right. There we go. Yeah, so you can do this.
Well, any configuration really, right?
Well, if you left it on the other end, it wouldn't
And,
actually do it.
I know when we were planking the Dublin Bay, we would use these a lot you could, to push one plank up to another plank, you could put that on a rib end and then squeeze it and squish it, so, I don't know if everybody knew that, but it was a real handy thing
It's a
to-
reverse clamp.
Yeah,
That's what I
Push
did,
things away.
the bottom of the Susan skid
Yeah.
for the plank.
yeah.
That makes sense.
The wedges are really handy for clamping stuff to your bench if you can't get something deep enough, or you don't want something in the way. You can fasten a block down and then use a wedge in between the block and the piece in order to keep it in place on the bench.
It's nice to clean them up if we've covered them with glue, so the next person doesn't go, doesn't this move with the heat gun.
And these Wetzelers are actually my favorite clamp. They just work really well, and you get quite a bit of pressure on them. Unfortunately, they don't make, or at least Wetzler doesn't make these anymore. But occasionally you'll find them, and if you do, I'd say, you know, grab them, because they are heavy-duty clamps which will last pretty much a lifetime.
Is this a Norwegian, considered a Norwegian clamp too? No, just this one with the.
Yeah,
Yep.
I don't know what you would call that.
A variation on it.
Yeah, really.